Hello, and welcome back to our discussion of Europe during the early phases of the Cold War. This week's module will be focusing on the various crises that erupt in Europe between 1956 and then abroad in the North American area, in the Caribbean, and relating to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The reason why we're looking at crises here is to give you a sense of how the boundaries that were being erected between the two different parts of the world, but particularly in Europe, one that was communist and one that was anti-communist, how those boundaries were being established, but also we're getting a greater sense of the various aspects or dimensions of this crisis. Last time we looked at the Hungarian uprising of 1956, and we got a sense of how dissension within one of these divided areas or blocks had led to intervention and a crisis that upturned the government of Hungary and was brought back into alignment with the rest of the communist nations in the East Central European area. You might recall that the crisis itself was one that forced Hungarians, in some cases, to leave the country. There were some tens of thousands who fled Hungary after that uprising, fearing repression or greater hardships as a result of what had happened. And there was also a sense of disappointment that arose that the Western powers did not intervene on their behalf. I think I wanted to underscore this point before we get started with today's lecture, because it's important to keep in mind that there were rules governing the Cold War behavior on both sides, and these were starting to take shape from the 1950s on. And in this case, we see that once there was a issue relating to internal governance in Hungary, it was resolved within the communist world and not one that was relating to Western powers, or at least intervention on their part. Now, Radio Free Europe and other Western-based organizations and activities were certainly encouraging of the Hungarians who wanted to greater liberalize and to pull away somewhat from the communist bloc area. But for the most part, as I said, there was a clear boundary here that was established and one that was observed and respected by the West. So the United States, for example, did not go into Hungary, even though some people felt that that might have been an appropriate action, given that it was an act of aggression on the part of the Soviet Union and its Warsaw member states. So as we go along, you might want to take notes and observe how these boundaries are being established and to what extent both sides are playing by rules, as I said, that will become part of the framework of the Cold War throughout much of the 20th century. Today, however, we want to look at Berlin and a crisis that erupts there in the late 1950s and early 60s. And we'll talk about then the outcome of which will be resulting in the creation of a barrier, a physical barrier between the two sides, the Berlin Wall. So we saw earlier when we looked at the Berlin airlift crisis in 1948-49 period that the question of how Berlin was to exist and flourish in the post-war period, now that Europe had been divided into these two mutually hostile camps. And Berlin seemed to be an anomaly insofar as it was located inside of the communist zone of East Germany. And as far as the Soviets were concerned and the communists in East Germany who governed that country, the Berlin issue was a thorn in their flesh. They wanted to resolve it as much as possible. So one of the reasons why this became increasingly an urgent problem for them to resolve was that many of those who sought to get from one side to the other side of Europe, in other words, from one zone to another, would use Berlin as a portal for that purpose. So what you're seeing in years leading up to this period of tensions, which will date between 1958 and 1961, or increasing number of people voting with their feet and fleeing over from the east into the west via Berlin. And this hemorrhaging of the population prompted the government of East Germany, but also the Soviets to obsess really over the fate of Berlin. Their real desire was to make sure that Berlin did not become a opening in the fence, so to speak, for the communists or the citizens living under communism to flee to the other side. And so for this and other reasons, the Berlin question had a certain sense of urgency for these governments. Now, the West was determined, as we saw in the Berlin airlift crisis earlier, to maintain West Berlin as much as possible and use it as an outpost for the West in the midst of these the communist zone. And so both sides were very determined to hold their position. But in 1958, the new leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, made it clear that he wanted to resolve this once and for all. He didn't want to approach it in quite the way that Stalin had, which, remember, was to have a showdown over Berlin. But he did, in a way, feel like it had to be resolved one way or the other. And his attitude was that Berlin could no longer be divided along the lines that it was, and that it needed to become what he called an open city, and one that more or less would then fall under the governance of the communist regime in East Germany. And so these pressures, as I said, came to a head first in 1958, and then intensified in the next year or so. In 1958, Khrushchev, in fact, issued an ultimatum, which he put a timeline on of 6 months, saying that he wanted this question of the future or fate of Berlin to be resolved, and said that if it wasn't, then he would take actions to make sure that the kind of future for Berlin that he had in mind would be implemented. And so this was a very serious and daring move on his part, and one that was greeted in the West with a great deal of anxiety, because nobody wanted another major crisis to erupt in Europe at this point. So Great Britain, France, and the United States, who were the occupying authorities in West Berlin, outrightly rejected this proposal that Khrushchev had issued. The question was, would he make good on his threat to move towards unifying the two divided parts of Berlin so that it could fall under communist rule. During the course of the next few months, however, other international affairs intervened in a way that diffused this tension that had arisen over the Berlin question. And in fact, Khrushchev himself decided to come to the United States in September of 1959. And this meant that in order to improve relations with the West, Khrushchev felt that pursuing this idea of an ultimatum did not make any sense, so he backed off from this position and more or less held it in abeyance from this point on. Now, the idea here was that Khrushchev, looking beyond the issues relating to Berlin itself or East Germany, realized that as he was trying to steer the Soviet Union now in this new course that he had announced earlier, he needed to improve relationship with the other superpower here, the United States. And so for this reason, as I said, he decided to take a more conciliatory approach to this and other issues. So for a brief period, it looked as though perhaps there would be a reversal of some of the kind of brinkmanship politics that were becoming commonplace in Europe at this time. And Khrushchev's visit to the United States went well for the most part. There was one brief point at which he was upset because he wasn't able to go to Disneyland. But beyond that, we see that Khrushchev and the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, were able to have a meeting of the minds, so to speak, and agree that there needed to be a greater common ground established between the two superpowers, because the Cold War itself could easily be steered towards a crisis situation, and one that would could lead to a more problematic situation for everyone around. So this was a recognition on both sides, and one, as I said, that helped to, as I said, for a brief period, create a reconciliation between the two superpowers here. But this path that looked like it was leading towards a greater comedy between the two superpowers was quickly interrupted or disrupted by an event that takes place in May of 1960s when a Western spy plane, the U-2 spy plane, which was flying over Soviet territory, was shot down, and the pilot, Gary Powers, was captured. And so this was clear evidence, as far as the Soviets were concerned, that the United States, who controlled this spy plane, really were acting in bad faith, and that their intentions really were to monitor activities inside the Soviet Union. And while the West, and the United States in particular, claimed that that wasn't their intention, that this was a plane that had gone off course, the result was, as I said, a controversy that soured relations that had seemed to be improving in recent months. So the next step then was to decide whether there was an opportunity for the United States and the Soviet Union to find a greater agreement on certain other issues. But this was kind of held in suspension briefly because there was an election that was coming up in the United States, and the Soviet Union wanted to wait and see who was going to be elected and deal with that new president. In this case, Dwight Eisenhower was not running for office. His Vice President Richard Nixon was, and Nixon himself was known as a fierce anti-communist. And his rival, John F. Kennedy, won the election, as we know, in November of 1960, and this put a new person in the White House, and one the Soviet Union did not know much about, but was certainly felt relieved that he was a young and relatively inexperienced statesman, and someone that the Soviet Union felt that they could work out better terms than his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower. So if we look at the timeline here, we can see that relations between East and West Germany, and not going beyond Berlin itself, were not good in the years leading up to the crisis of 1958 to 1961 period. And in fact, the German government had refused to recognize East Germany and really refused to have any dealings with it. And so this put a real damper on any improved relationships between these two Germanys, which had emerged since the late 1940s. And then with this ultimatum that comes in 1958, we see that that the focus is on creating some sort of a path here so that East Germany could consolidate its position over Berlin, and that West Germany then would go its separate ways. So it looked as though, as I said, that there was an impasse here that had been reached, and one that wasn't improved even with the fact that, in view of the fact that Khrushchev and the United States had tried to work out some common ground here, especially with regard to disarmament, or at least limiting arms on both sides. But now that Kennedy was in office, Khrushchev decided that he would step up his efforts to resolve this Berlin issue. Again, he sensed in this young and relatively inexperienced president that he had an opening, and he was going to pursue this. So in the summer of 1961, things started to come to a head in this regard. In Vienna, Khrushchev and Kennedy meet for the first time, and at this meeting, Khrushchev wants to get a sense of how effective Kennedy is as a international leader. He feels that his years of experience, Khrushchev's, was one that far outweighed the qualities that Kennedy could bring to the table. And in that sense, he felt confident that he could get his way over this issue relating to Berlin. So in June of 1961, this summit takes place, but in the end, it looked as though Khrushchev was right, that he was able to outmaneuver Kennedy on a lot of critical issues. But he also found that Kennedy was unmovable when it came to issues like West Berlin. And so this put this whole question back into the unresolved status, and one that Khrushchev was determined one way or another to get rid of as a problem as far as he was concerned. So Khrushchev, appealing to the rational plan that he had put forward, which was to demilitarize the city and to make it a point of easing tensions between the East and West rather than one that was constantly provoking them. All those things made sense on one level, but as I said, couldn't really satisfy the demands of the West, who did not want to relinquish their control over West Berlin. So in the meanwhile, these economic, social pressures that I alluded to earlier, the fact that there were more and more East Germans who were trying to use Berlin as an avenue for them getting out of the communist zone into the West, that problem was exacerbated in recent months. The economic disparities between West Berlin and East Berlin were very evident, and this was something, as I said, that helped to fuel this exodus of people. And so it was becoming a serious problem, not just for the Soviets in terms of their international or foreign diplomacy, but also for the East German government, which felt like this had to be dealt with as soon as possible. One feature of this diaspora of East Germans was the fact that many of those leaving were trained or highly skilled technicians, and so this so-called brain drain was something that was depleting East Germany of some of the valuable resources that it needed to rebuild after the war. So all those pressures were part of the equation that then influenced Khrushchev to take more decisive action if it was possible in the summer of 1961. You can see here, though, while I'm describing the relationships here between the United States and the Soviet Union, that the country that was most directly involved, East Germany, was one that was really at the beck and call of the Soviet Union. And this would be true throughout the Cold War, that as much as problems or concerns might arise within a national boundary, the final arbiters would be these two superpowers. And so this was clearly what was happening in this case. So East Germany was putting pressure on the Soviet Union to speak on its behalf and to solve a problem. But at the end of the day, it was the Soviet Union which made the decisions that directly affected the fate of East Germany. So as the tensions, as I said, relating to the Berlin question continued to fester in the summer of 1961, a decision was finally made in the communist world, and that was to seal off West Berlin from East Berlin. And how was this to be done, one might ask? And their decision was a very simple one, and perhaps one that they might have later regretted, which was to build a barrier, a physical barrier between the two sides of Berlin. So as soon as they were able to, in the early morning hours of August of 1961, the East Germans began constructing a wall that separated East Berlin from West Berlin. And this would then become later more famously known as the Berlin Wall, or the Wall of Shame, as it was referred to by West Berliners and others. In other words, the idea here was to say that if we can't have an open city, we were going to make sure that the communist world was sealed off from the pro-capitalist liberal world, and that's exactly what they did. So they built this physical structure. Of course, not all the features of the wall would come into place overnight, and it would take several years before it would be completed. But in the end, it would be a very ugly physical reminder of how divided this city was, and in a larger sense, how divided Europe was along these lines. So the Berlin Wall then becomes the resolution to this problem as far as both sides are concerned. So instead of issuing further ultimatums, the communists decided to put up this wall, which would mean that from now on there was no free or easy access between the two sides of Berlin, which would cut off the stream of individuals trying to get over to the other side and make it much more difficult for that sort of migration to take place. So over the years, as I said, the reputation and kind of notoriety of the Berlin Wall would reverberate throughout Europe and the rest of the world. And it wouldn't be until the end of the Cold War in 1989 that this would return as a major symbol of what was going on in the Cold War in Europe. In the meanwhile, we see that Berlin, as I said, or the Berlin question had been resolved by the creation of this barrier. So it may not have been a public relations victory for the communists, for sure, but at least it put to rest this whole idea that there could be an agreement that would bridge the chasm between the East and the West over what to do about Berlin. So as far as the crisis was concerned, it blew up. It didn't reach the point of confrontation, certainly, which again becomes another characteristic feature of the Cold War as we're reviewing it, but it certainly meant that from now on, Berlin would certainly look much different, and so would the rest of Europe. Just as if we fast forwarded for the next few years, we can see that the Berlin Wall would become a symbol of not just of the division of Europe, but also of the repression as far as the West was concerned that was being used to keep the communist world contained. And so future presidents of the United States, including John F. Kennedy, would come to the Berlin Wall at different points, and they would declare their support for the West Berlin freedoms and liberalism and use this as a way of, or as a weapon or instrument of propaganda against their rivals in the East.